The sea did not give him away. The fire did not claim him. The men sent to erase him failed before he even learned his own name. Long before he could lift a sword or understand the weight of blood, a newborn child became the center of a secret powerful enough to shake every Viking kingdom across the north. The king who should have protected him signed away his future with a single command. No songs were written about that night. No runestones recorded what truly happened. The few who witnessed it carried the truth to their graves, believing the lie would outlive them all. But lies have a way of returning, especially when they are written in blood. And 27 winters later, a man who believed he was nothing more than a humble blacksmith unknowingly walked toward the people who had spent their entire lives praying he would never come home. Engage in our comment section and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Drop your location below. And subscribe now so you never miss any of our new videos, because by the end, you'll understand why some kingdoms are destroyed not by invading armies, but by the children they abandoned. The old stories of the Vikings speak of mighty kings, fearless shield maidens, impossible journeys across frozen seas, and battles fought beneath skies glowing with the northern lights. Yet hidden beneath those celebrated legends were stories whispered only in isolated villages after the fires burned low, stories considered too dangerous to speak aloud while the wind still carried voices across the fjords. This is one of those forgotten stories. It begins during the reign of a ruler whose victories united dozens of rival clans beneath a single banner. His kingdom stretched farther than anyone thought possible, reaching from snow-covered mountains to restless northern waters. Every neighboring ruler feared him. Every warrior wished to serve him. Every enemy prayed he would never turn his attention toward their shores. His strength became legend long before he reached old age, but the greatest battle he ever fought was not against foreign invaders. It was against fear itself, a fear that slowly transformed one of the most respected rulers in Viking history into a father willing to sacrifice everything to protect his throne. Far from the king's magnificent hall stood a quiet coastal settlement where fishermen, hunters, and craftsmen lived simple lives untouched by royal politics. Among them lived a woman whose beauty was admired across the surrounding villages. Her name was Evelyn, and although she possessed neither noble blood nor great wealth, people respected her for her kindness, courage, and unwavering honesty. Years earlier, while traveling through the kingdom disguised as an ordinary warrior, the king met Evelyn by chance after a violent storm forced his company to seek shelter along the coast. Neither revealed their true identities. For several weeks, they shared conversations beside crackling fires, laughed over simple meals, and slowly fell deeply in love. The king promised he would return after settling matters in his capital. Evelyn believed every word. She watched his ship disappear beyond the morning mist, convinced fate had delivered the man she would spend the rest of her life with. Months passed without a single message. Unknown to Evelyn, powerful nobles inside the royal court had discovered their ruler's secret relationship. They feared that if a common woman bore the king's child, generations of carefully guarded alliances would collapse. Rival clans would challenge the legitimacy of the future heir. Civil war could tear apart everything the kingdom had fought to build. Rather than risk instability, the king's closest advisors demanded he abandon the woman forever. They reminded him that rulers did not belong to themselves. They belonged to the kingdom. Torn between duty and love, he chose the throne. It was the decision that haunted every remaining year of his life. By the time he gathered enough courage to return to the village, Evelyn had already given birth to a healthy baby boy with striking pale eyes that reminded everyone of frozen northern lakes. She named him Mason, believing his father would one day return to meet the son he never knew existed. The king arrived in secret beneath the cover of darkness, expecting forgiveness. Instead, he found heartbreak waiting for him. Evelyn welcomed him without anger, placing the sleeping child gently into his arms. For several silent moments, the ruler who had conquered countless enemies stood completely speechless as his infant son wrapped tiny fingers around one of his own. It should have been the happiest moment of his life. Instead, it became the beginning of an impossible choice. Hidden among the king's escort was his most trusted advisor, a calculating noble named Victor, whose loyalty belonged not to the royal family, but to political survival. Victor had already arranged everything. If the king acknowledged the child publicly, influential clans would revolt before winter ended. Several rival jarls had secretly promised to assassinate both mother and child if they ever appeared inside the capital. Victor presented the king with only two choices. Watch his kingdom collapse into endless bloodshed or allow the child to disappear forever, protected by anonymity instead of royal blood. Faced with a decision no father should ever confront, the king closed his eyes and whispered words he would regret until his final breath. Take the boy where no one will ever find him. The order spread quickly through the small group accompanying the king. Most obeyed without question, believing they were protecting the realm. One man refused. His name was Samuel, an aging warrior who had served 3 generations of rulers and earned respect through unwavering honor rather than political ambition. Samuel looked at the sleeping child, then at the broken expression covering the king's face, and understood that history was about to remember the wrong version of events. He accepted custody of the infant without protest, but inside he had already decided he would never deliver the child to those waiting beyond the mountains. Instead, before dawn broke across the sea, Samuel quietly left the royal convoy, carrying little Mason wrapped inside heavy wool blankets as snow began falling over the winding trails leading north. By sunrise, everyone searching for the child believed wolves had intercepted the old warrior somewhere within the forest. Search parties discovered abandoned footprints disappearing into fresh snowfall before vanishing completely. No bodies were found. No blood stained the ground. The kingdom accepted the simplest explanation. Mother and son were mourned. The king buried his grief beneath years of warfare, while Samuel vanished so completely that even the finest trackers eventually abandoned the search. 27 years later, the forgotten child had become a man unlike anyone around him. Mason lived inside a quiet mountain village hundreds of miles from the kingdom that had once hunted him. Samuel raised him as his own grandson, teaching him discipline, humility, and craftsmanship while carefully hiding every clue connected to his birth. Mason became the village blacksmith, admired for creating weapons so perfectly balanced that experienced warriors traveled days just to purchase one of his handcrafted axes or swords. Despite his remarkable strength, he remained humble. He repaired farming tools without charging widows. He worked late into freezing nights helping neighbors rebuild after storms. Children followed him through the village because he always found time to laugh with them. Yet beneath his calm personality lingered questions he could never answer. Every winter strange dreams interrupted his sleep. He saw unfamiliar castles standing beside towering cliffs. He heard voices calling him by a name he did not recognize. Sometimes he woke before dawn with his hands trembling, unable to explain why the sound of distant wolves filled him with comfort instead of fear. Samuel noticed every change, but said nothing. The old warrior had spent nearly 3 decades protecting the greatest secret in the north, knowing the truth would eventually find them no matter how carefully he tried to hide it. Age had slowed his body, yet his instincts remained as sharp as ever. Travelers arriving from southern kingdoms carried troubling news. The aging king had become increasingly isolated, refusing advice from longtime allies while preparing for conflicts nobody else believed were coming. Entire villages reported sightings of mysterious warriors appearing only during nights illuminated by an unusually large moon. Livestock disappeared without explanation. Hunters claimed enormous animal tracks surrounded abandoned campsites before ending abruptly where no ordinary creature could possibly travel. Most dismissed those stories as drunken exaggerations told inside crowded taverns. Samuel did not. He recognized patterns others overlooked because he remembered truths the rest of the world had forgotten. The past was beginning to move again, and sooner or later it would arrive at Mason's doorstep. Everything changed on the afternoon a procession of richly dressed riders entered the mountain village without warning. Their polished armor reflected the sunlight while colorful banners danced above them in the cold wind. At their center rode a young noblewoman whose confidence commanded attention long before anyone noticed her extraordinary beauty. Her golden hair flowed beneath a finely crafted cloak trimmed with white fur, while piercing green eyes carefully studied every face lining the village streets. This was Charlotte, daughter of one of the wealthiest and most influential jarls in the kingdom. Officially, her entourage claimed they were traveling north to negotiate trade agreements involving iron, timber, and weapons. Unofficially, Charlotte carried private instructions known only to her father. Rumors had reached the southern courts describing an unusually gifted blacksmith living somewhere among the mountains. She intended to discover whether those rumors were true. The moment Charlotte's eyes settled on Mason working outside his forge, something unexpected passed between them. Neither smiled. Neither spoke. Yet for reasons neither could explain, both found themselves unable to look away. Charlotte expected arrogance from a craftsman whose reputation had spread across several kingdoms. Instead, Mason barely acknowledged her presence before returning to shaping glowing steel beneath the rhythmic strike of his hammer. Accustomed to admiration wherever she traveled, Charlotte found his indifference strangely unsettling. She approached the forge under the pretense of examining his work, asking thoughtful questions about the sword resting across his anvil. Mason answered politely but briefly, refusing to flatter her title or impressive lineage. Their conversation lasted only minutes, yet every exchange carried an unusual tension that neither fully understood. Charlotte noticed scars covering his hands, earned through years of honest labor rather than battle. Mason noticed intelligence behind her composed expression, something deeper than noble privilege. As she finally turned to leave, Charlotte glanced back only once, surprised to discover Mason already watching her. Neither realized that an elderly man standing quietly inside the forge had witnessed everything. Samuel's weathered face tightened with concern. He recognized the crest embroidered upon Charlotte's cloak. Fate had finally arrived, and it had come wearing the colors of the very family responsible for destroying Mason's life before it had even begun. Samuel did not sleep that night. Long after the forge grew cold and the village settled into silence, he remained seated beside the fading embers, staring toward the mountains where heavy clouds swallowed the moon. For 27 years he had prepared himself for this exact moment, yet nothing could ease the weight pressing against his chest. Charlotte's arrival was no coincidence. Powerful families did not travel for weeks across dangerous mountain passes simply to purchase iron. They came searching for something, and Samuel feared that something was sitting only a few feet away, unaware that every choice he made from this moment forward could decide the fate of kingdoms. Mason noticed the old warrior's troubled expression before sunrise. "You've barely spoken since yesterday," he said while sharpening a hunting knife. "Is something wrong?" Samuel forced a faint smile and shook his head. "Some storms arrive without thunder," he quietly answered. "The wise prepare before the sky changes." Mason frowned, uncertain what the old man meant, but years of living together had taught him not to press further when Samuel chose silence over explanation. By mid-morning, the village square had transformed into a lively marketplace as Charlotte's escort negotiated with merchants and craftsmen. While most visitors admired finished swords and polished shields, Charlotte seemed interested in only one person. She returned to Mason's forge carrying a damaged hunting spear, though anyone with experience could immediately see it required no repair. "I've been told you're the finest blacksmith in the north," she said with a calm smile. "Would you take a look?" Mason accepted the weapon, examined it carefully, and looked back at her. "There's nothing wrong with this spear." Charlotte laughed softly, impressed that he had recognized her excuse so quickly. "Perhaps I wanted an honest answer instead of polite conversation." Mason returned the spear without smiling. Honesty is usually less comfortable than polite conversation. For the first time in many years, Charlotte found herself speaking with someone who treated her as an ordinary woman instead of the daughter of one of the kingdom's most influential rulers. She realized she preferred it that way. Their conversations became a daily routine. Charlotte wandered through the village under the excuse of learning about northern craftsmanship, while Mason reluctantly found himself answering questions that had little to do with iron or steel. She asked why he never left the mountains despite possessing skills that could earn him wealth inside any royal court. Mason answered simply, "Peace has more value than gold." She asked whether he had ever considered starting a family. He paused longer before answering that question than any other. "I never thought much about it." Charlotte studied his face, sensing there was more behind those words than he wished to reveal. She shared stories about growing up among nobles where every friendship carried hidden motives and every smile often concealed ambition. Mason listened without judgment. Their worlds could not have been more different, yet each conversation dissolved another invisible wall between them. Villagers quietly noticed the growing connection. Some smiled with amusement. Samuel watched with growing concern because he recognized a danger neither young soul could yet see. Love had begun walking a road built upon secrets. Several days later, Charlotte insisted on exploring the surrounding forests before continuing her journey south. Against his better judgment, Mason agreed to accompany her after Samuel urged him to remain cautious. The mountains were breathtaking beneath fresh snowfall. Crystal streams wound through towering pines while hawks circled high above cliffs, carved by centuries of wind and ice. Charlotte admitted she had never experienced such freedom away from palace walls and endless ceremonies. For a few precious hours she laughed without restraint, climbed rocky paths despite her expensive boots, and challenged Mason to races across open meadows blanketed with wildflowers. Watching her leave behind the careful manners expected of nobility revealed a side of Charlotte no court had ever been allowed to see. Mason found himself smiling more than he had in years. He almost forgot that peace rarely lasts long in stories shaped by destiny. The attack came without warning. A frightened herd of deer burst through the trees, racing wildly as if escaping an unseen predator. Birds abandoned the forest canopy all at once, filling the sky with frantic wings. Mason immediately stopped walking. Every instinct inside him screamed that something was terribly wrong. Charlotte noticed the sudden change in his expression just as an arrow struck the tree beside her head. Before either could react, masked warriors emerged from every direction, surrounding them with frightening speed. Their clothing carried no recognizable banners, and their faces remained hidden beneath dark hoods. "Take the woman alive," one shouted. "Kill the blacksmith." Mason pushed Charlotte behind him and reached for the wood-cutting axe hanging across his back. The first attacker charged confidently, expecting an easy victory against a village craftsman. Instead, Mason disarmed him with astonishing precision before sending him crashing into the frozen ground. A second attacker lunged from the side. Mason blocked the strike, twisted the man's wrist until the sword fell free, and ended the fight with a single powerful blow. Charlotte stared in disbelief. This was not ordinary skill learned inside a forge. Mason fought like someone trained by legendary warriors. The battle intensified as more attackers poured from the forest. Mason placed himself between Charlotte and every incoming strike, refusing to allow anyone near her. Although outnumbered, he moved with incredible speed, anticipating attacks almost before they happened. Yet, even his remarkable strength could not prevent every injury. A blade sliced across his shoulder, drawing blood that stained the snow beneath his feet. Charlotte instinctively rushed toward him despite the danger. "You're hurt," she cried. Mason ignored the wound and continued fighting until the remaining attackers suddenly retreated as mysteriously as they had appeared. Within seconds, the forest fell silent again. Only scattered footprints and abandoned weapons remained. Breathing heavily, Mason leaned against a nearby tree while Charlotte hurried to his side. She tore a strip from her cloak and carefully wrapped the wound across his shoulder. Their eyes met only inches apart. Neither spoke. The world around them seemed to disappear beneath the steady rhythm of their breathing. Charlotte gently brushed a loose strand of hair away from his face before softly pressing her lips against his forehead. It was a brief gesture born from relief rather than impulse, yet neither would ever forget it. As they began the long journey back toward the village, Charlotte could not stop replaying the battle inside her mind. Whoever those attackers were, they had not come seeking treasure or supplies. They had come specifically for her. More troubling still was Mason's extraordinary ability to defeat experienced warriors despite claiming to have lived his entire life as a simple blacksmith. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" she finally asked. Mason hesitated before answering. "Samuel taught me enough to survive if trouble ever found this village." Charlotte slowly nodded, though the explanation satisfied neither her curiosity nor her instincts. Something about Mason refused to fit together. Every answer uncovered another question. She found herself wanting the truth even if it frightened her. Back in the village, Samuel carefully examined the abandoned weapons recovered from the forest. His expression hardened the moment he recognized the unusual markings carved into their steel. He had seen those symbols only once before, on the night he fled with an infant wrapped beneath heavy blankets, while loyal soldiers searched every road leading north. These men had not been common bandits. They belonged to a secret network that answered directly to influential figures within the royal court. Someone had discovered Mason was alive. Samuel quietly slipped one of the blades beneath his cloak before anyone else noticed the markings. He knew there was no more time to delay the truth. If powerful enemies had resumed the search after nearly 3 decades, hiding would no longer keep Mason safe. The past had finally crossed the mountains, and before long it would arrive carrying names, faces, and answers capable of changing everything Mason believed about himself. That evening, Charlotte stood alone outside the guest lodge overlooking the sleeping village. The stars shimmered above snow-covered rooftops, while distant wolves howled somewhere beyond the dark forest. She had traveled across countless kingdoms, attended grand feasts, and met rulers whose names filled history, yet none had unsettled her heart the way one quiet blacksmith had in only a matter of days. She could not explain why his presence felt strangely familiar, or why every instinct urged her to remain a little longer before returning home. Unknown to Charlotte, another pair of eyes watched from the shadows beyond the village. A lone rider had arrived after sunset, studying every movement from the edge of the forest. After confirming Mason's identity, the stranger quietly turned his horse south toward the royal capital. The message he carried would reach the king within days. The lost child everyone believed had vanished forever was alive, and the kingdom's oldest secret was about to awaken. The rider reached the royal capital 3 days later, delivering his report before sunrise inside a stone chamber where only a handful of trusted advisors were permitted to enter. King Alexander, whose victories had united the northern kingdoms decades earlier, listened without interrupting. His expression remained calm until the messenger uttered a single sentence. "The blacksmith bears your eyes." Silence settled over the chamber like winter frost. Every advisor understood the meaning without further explanation. The child believed to have vanished nearly 3 decades earlier had survived. For a long moment the king stared into the flames dancing inside the great hearth, remembering the tiny infant he had held only once before allowing fear to overrule love. He had convinced himself the boy had perished long ago. Now that illusion was gone forever. Victor, the aging advisor who had orchestrated the child's disappearance all those years ago, stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "if the truth becomes known, every alliance holding this kingdom together will begin to fracture. The rival Jarls never wanted your bloodline strengthened. They will see this young man as either a rightful heir or a weapon to use against you. We cannot allow him to reach the capital alive." The king slowly lifted his eyes toward Victor. "No," he replied quietly. "You will not touch him. Bring him to me. This time I will decide his fate with my own eyes." Back in the mountain village, Mason sensed that something had shifted after the attack in the forest. Travelers who once greeted strangers warmly had begun watching unfamiliar faces with suspicion. Hunters reported seeing armed men camping along distant ridges. Even the village dogs barked restlessly throughout the night, as though detecting a danger invisible to everyone else. Samuel became unusually protective, insisting Mason never travel alone despite never explaining why. Charlotte noticed the change as well. She had postponed her return journey twice, officially blaming damaged wagon wheels and poor weather, but privately she knew the real reason. Every instinct told her leaving now would be a mistake. She found herself searching for excuses to spend time beside Mason, whether helping distribute supplies, walking through the snowy forests, or simply sitting beside the forge while sparks floated into the evening sky. Their conversations no longer felt cautious. They laughed more easily. They challenged each other's opinions. They shared memories that neither had ever spoken aloud before. Charlotte confessed she hated the endless expectations placed upon noble daughters. Mason admitted he sometimes dreamed of places he had never seen. Neither realized those dreams were memories waiting to return. One afternoon, Charlotte asked to see the highest cliff overlooking the valley. Mason agreed, leading her along a narrow trail winding through ancient pine forests until the land suddenly opened to reveal an endless view of frozen lakes, distant mountains, and rivers shimmering beneath the afternoon sun. Charlotte stood speechless. "I've visited castles larger than entire villages," she whispered, "but I've never seen anything more beautiful than this." Mason smiled. "Samuel brought me here whenever I felt lost. He always said the mountains remind us how small our fears really are." Charlotte looked toward him instead of the landscape. "Do they still?" Mason hesitated. "Not anymore." She stepped closer. "Why?" His voice grew softer. "Because lately, my fears aren't about myself." Charlotte understood before he finished the sentence. The distance between them disappeared naturally, neither rushing nor retreating. She gently placed her hand against his face, searching his eyes for any sign of uncertainty. Finding none, she kissed him softly. It lasted only a few moments, but when they finally stepped apart, the silence between them carried more meaning than words ever could. Neither promised forever. Neither spoke of love. They simply knew that whatever lay ahead, neither wished to face it alone. Their quiet happiness lasted less than an hour. As they descended the mountain path, they discovered smoke rising from the village below. Mason broke into a sprint before Charlotte could stop him. By the time they arrived, several buildings stood engulfed in flames while frightened families rushed to rescue children and livestock. Armed riders wearing dark cloaks surrounded the square, demanding someone surrender the blacksmith known as Mason. Samuel stood at the center of the chaos with sword in hand despite his age, refusing to move aside. One of the attackers raised a torch toward the forge. "Hand him over," the man shouted, "or everyone here pays the price." Mason stepped forward before anyone else could answer. "I'm the one you're looking for." Samuel immediately grabbed his arm. "No," Mason looked calmly at the old warrior. "They'll burn everything if I don't." Before another word could be exchanged, Charlotte unexpectedly drew her own sword and stood beside Mason. "If you want him," she declared, "you'll have to come through both of us." The attackers hesitated. They had expected frightened villagers, not determined resistance. The battle erupted with terrifying speed. Mason fought with the same extraordinary skill Charlotte had witnessed in the forest, protecting innocent villagers while carefully avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. Charlotte matched him strike for strike, proving she was every bit the warrior her reputation claimed. Together they drove the attackers back through the narrow streets until their leader suddenly sounded a retreat. Instead of continuing the fight, the masked warriors disappeared into the surrounding woods almost as quickly as they had arrived. The victory brought little comfort. Several homes had been destroyed, supplies were lost, and one elderly villager lay seriously wounded. As neighbors rushed to help one another, Samuel quietly retrieved an object dropped by the fleeing commander, a silver medallion bearing the crest of the royal court. He slipped it into his pocket before anyone else noticed. That evening, Samuel finally accepted what he had resisted for 27 years. The truth could no longer remain buried. He invited Mason into the small cabin where they had lived together since childhood. Charlotte waited outside, sensing this conversation belonged to them alone. Samuel opened an old wooden chest hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside rested a finely crafted infant blanket embroidered with a faded royal crest, a signet ring bearing the symbol of the Northern Crown, and a leather journal sealed with worn wax. Mason stared silently at the objects. "Whose are these?" Samuel answered with tears forming in his weathered eyes. "They belong to the family you were born into." Mason slowly looked up. "What are you talking about?" Samuel took a long breath before speaking words he had rehearsed countless times but hoped never to say. Mason, I am not your grandfather. I rescued you when you were only a few days old. The name you've carried your entire life was never the one given to you at birth. Your father is alive. He's the king. The room fell completely silent. Mason searched Samuel's face, hoping to find some sign that this was a cruel misunderstanding. Instead, he found only sorrow. Every unanswered question from his childhood suddenly returned at once. The dreams, the strange memories, the unexplained skills. None of them had been accidents. Outside the cabin, Charlotte noticed movement among the trees bordering the village. A lone figure stood watching the house before disappearing into the darkness. She instinctively followed, moving carefully between snow-covered pines until she reached a narrow clearing. There she overheard two cloaked riders speaking in hushed voices. "Victor wants the old man eliminated before sunrise," one whispered. "Once Samuel is dead, no one can prove the blacksmith's identity." Charlotte's heart pounded. They were not simply hunting Mason anymore. They intended to erase every witness connected to his past. She hurried back toward the cabin as fast as she could, unaware that the riders had already noticed her presence. By the time she reached the village, shadows were moving silently between the houses. The next attack had already begun. Charlotte burst through the cabin door without stopping to catch her breath. "They're here," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "Victor's men know everything. Samuel is their first target." Mason reacted instantly, reaching for the sword he had forged with his own hands years earlier. Samuel closed the wooden chest, his expression strangely calm despite the danger closing in around them. "Then the time for hiding has ended," he said quietly. Before anyone could speak again, the cabin windows shattered inward as arrows tore through the room. Mason pulled Charlotte to the floor while Samuel overturned the heavy table for cover. Outside, dozens of armed riders poured into the village from every direction. Flames erupted across rooftops as terrified families fled into the snowy streets. The attackers showed no interest in stealing supplies or claiming territory. They had come with one purpose: to erase every person capable of connecting Mason to the throne. The peaceful mountain village that had given him a home for nearly 3 decades had suddenly become a battlefield. Mason fought with a determination unlike anything Charlotte had witnessed before. Every strike carried the weight of protecting the people who had raised him rather than simply defending himself. He moved through the burning streets rescuing children trapped inside collapsing homes, pulling wounded villagers away from falling beams, and forcing the attackers back despite being heavily outnumbered. Charlotte fought beside him without hesitation, refusing to leave his side even as the battle grew more desperate. Samuel, though slowed by age, proved why warriors had once spoken his name with respect throughout the North. His experience compensated for fading strength, and more than once he intercepted attacks that would have ended Mason's life. Yet Victor's soldiers continued arriving in waves, their discipline revealing years of careful preparation. This was no spontaneous raid. Someone had expected this day for a very long time. In the middle of the chaos, Victor himself rode into the village surrounded by heavily armored guards. Time had added silver to his hair, but had done nothing to soften the cold ambition behind his eyes. He surveyed the destruction with complete indifference before his gaze settled on Mason. So, he called out loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "The forgotten prince finally stands where everyone can see him." The villagers froze in disbelief. Mason stood motionless, still struggling to accept Samuel's revelation, while whispers spread rapidly through the crowd. Victor smiled as confusion rippled across every face. "You deserve the truth," he continued. "The man you call your father abandoned you before you could even speak. He chose a crown over his own blood. He allowed your name to disappear because you were inconvenient." Mason gripped his sword tighter, but the anger rising inside him came less from Victor's words than from the possibility that they might be true. Samuel stepped forward despite Charlotte's attempt to stop him. "Enough lies," the old warrior declared. "You forced that choice upon the king. You convinced him there was no other path." Victor's smile faded. History remembers results, not excuses. Without warning, he drew a concealed dagger and hurled it directly toward Samuel. Mason reacted instinctively, knocking the weapon aside moments before it struck its target. The brief distraction allowed Victor's guards to surround them completely. "Take the prince alive," Victor ordered. "The others are of no value." A fierce battle erupted once more. Charlotte fought with unmatched determination, refusing to allow anyone near Mason. Side by side, they defended one another with complete trust, anticipating each other's movements as though years of partnership had already passed. During one desperate exchange, Mason stumbled after taking a heavy blow across his ribs. Charlotte immediately stepped between him and an advancing soldier, blocking the fatal strike with her own shield before driving the attacker back. Their eyes met for only an instant, but that single glance carried a silent promise. Neither intended to survive without the other. Just as the attackers threatened to overwhelm them, the unmistakable sound of war horns echoed across the mountains. Every soldier paused. New riders descended from the northern pass, their banners unfamiliar even to Victor. At their head rode a broad-shouldered warrior wearing weathered armor, marked with the symbol of a white wolf. His name was Elias, commander of a forgotten band of warriors once loyal to the king before disappearing years earlier. Samuel stared in astonishment. "I thought they were all gone," he whispered. Elias dismounted without taking his eyes off Mason. "We promised your father that if the boy ever resurfaced, we would stand between him and anyone who wished him dead." Victor's confidence immediately faltered. He had expected frightened villagers, not seasoned warriors sworn to protect the kingdom's lost heir. The battle shifted almost instantly. Victor's forces, realizing they had lost the advantage, began retreating toward the forest under a hail of arrows. Before leaving, Victor fixed his eyes on Mason one final time. "This changes nothing," he shouted. "The king will never allow you to live once he remembers what you truly are." Then he disappeared into the darkness with the remnants of his army. When the fires were finally extinguished, the village resembled a place caught between survival and ruin. Families searched through damaged homes while neighbors comforted the grieving. Mason helped rebuild what he could, but his thoughts remained consumed by questions that refused to leave him. That evening, Elias approached him carrying a worn leather satchel sealed with the royal crest. "The king ordered this delivered only if you were ever found," he explained. Mason accepted the satchel with uncertain hands. Inside lay a folded letter written decades earlier. The parchment had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. Mason unfolded it slowly. "My son, if these words ever reach you, then fate has shown me a kindness I no longer deserve. You will one day hear that I abandoned you. Perhaps you already believe it. I cannot erase the pain my decision caused, nor can I ask forgiveness before earning it. I believed hiding you was the only way to keep you alive while enemies surrounded the throne. Every year I regretted that choice. Every victory felt empty because I could not share it with you. If you are reading this, then you survived where stronger men failed. Whatever name you carry now, know this: you were never forgotten, not for a single day." Mason read the letter twice before folding it carefully. The words did not erase 27 years of absence, yet they shattered the image of a heartless father Victor had tried to create. Charlotte quietly placed her hand over his. "What will you do?" she asked. Mason looked toward the distant southern horizon where the royal capital lay beyond countless rivers and mountains. "I don't know if I can forgive him," he admitted. "But I need to hear the truth from his own mouth." Samuel nodded slowly. "Then your journey begins now." Before sunrise the following morning, Mason, Charlotte, Samuel, and Elias left the village accompanied by a small company of loyal warriors. Their destination was the royal capital, where answers, and perhaps judgment, waited behind stone walls older than memory. Unknown to them, Victor had reached the capital first. Standing before King Alexander, he twisted the events in the mountain village into a convincing lie, claiming Mason had raised an army to seize the throne by force. The exhausted king listened in silence, torn between hope and doubt. Before making any decision, he gave a single command: "Bring my son to me alive." Victor bowed respectfully, hiding the frustration burning behind his composed expression. If the king and his son ever met face to face, decades of carefully constructed deception would collapse. He understood there was only one remaining solution. Mason had to die before reaching the capital. As Mason's company crossed the first frozen river on their long journey south, none of them noticed the figures watching from distant cliffs. Scouts loyal to Victor tracked every mile they traveled, waiting patiently for the perfect place to strike. The road ahead wound through a narrow mountain pass known as Raven's Gate, where towering stone walls left little room to escape an ambush. Elias studied the dark cliffs with growing unease. "Keep your weapons close," he warned. "If I were Victor, this is exactly where I'd be waiting." Mason looked ahead at the silent pass disappearing into heavy mist. Something deep inside him, an instinct he could neither explain nor ignore, whispered that the greatest battle of his life was only moments away. The cold silence surrounding Raven's Gate felt unnatural. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass between the towering cliffs. Elias raised a clenched fist, bringing the entire company to a halt. Every warrior instinctively reached for a weapon as their horses grew restless beneath them. Mason slowly scanned the ridges above, sensing eyes watching from somewhere beyond the thick morning mist. Charlotte moved beside him without a word, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. Neither needed to speak anymore. After everything they had survived together, they understood each other's instincts better than words ever could. Then, without warning, the first boulder crashed onto the narrow mountain road, shattering the frozen ground only a few feet ahead. A second followed, then a third. Within seconds, arrows rained down from both cliffs, forcing the travelers to scatter as Victor's soldiers emerged from carefully concealed positions high above the pass. The trap had been prepared long before they arrived. The battle exploded across the valley with terrifying force. Elias immediately ordered his warriors to push toward higher ground while Samuel guided the frightened horses away from the collapsing rocks. Mason fought through wave after wave of attackers, refusing to allow the narrow pass to become a graveyard for those who had risked everything to protect him. Charlotte remained beside him, matching every strike with remarkable precision. Together they carved a path through the ambush, but Victor had anticipated their every move. Hidden archers continued firing from impossible angles while fresh soldiers descended from the cliffs. One arrow pierced Elias's shoulder. Another struck Samuel in the leg, forcing the old warrior to one knee. Mason rushed toward him, only to hear Victor's voice echo through the valley. "You've inherited your father's heart," Victor shouted from atop the cliff. "Always trying to save everyone. That weakness will destroy you exactly as it destroyed him." Mason looked upward, finally seeing the man responsible for decades of suffering. Victor stood confidently above the battlefield surrounded by elite guards, convinced victory was only moments away. "You stole my life before I could remember it," Mason answered. "You destroyed my mother's future. You lied to a king and called it loyalty. Today your lies end." Victor smiled. "History is written by survivors." He raised his hand. Hundreds more soldiers emerged from hidden tunnels carved deep into the mountain. Charlotte's face paled. "This was never an ambush," she whispered. "It was an execution." The fighting grew desperate. Loyal warriors began falling one after another beneath overwhelming numbers. Samuel struggled back to his feet despite his injury, refusing to retreat. Elias continued fighting with an arrow still buried in his shoulder, inspiring the remaining soldiers to hold their ground. Mason realized they could not win by remaining trapped inside the pass. If they stayed, everyone would die. Searching desperately for another way, his eyes settled upon the towering wall of ice overlooking the valley. Years of freezing winters had created an enormous shelf hanging above Victor's army. He turned toward Charlotte. "Do you trust me?" She didn't hesitate. "With my life." Without another word, Mason sprinted toward the cliff while Charlotte and Elias fought fiercely to buy him time. Arrows chased him across the frozen rocks as Victor laughed, believing the young man had surrendered to panic. Mason climbed higher and higher until he reached the enormous wall of ice. Raising his father's sword with both hands, he struck the frozen surface with every ounce of strength he possessed. The first blow cracked the ice. The second sent fractures racing across the mountain. The third unleashed a deafening roar that echoed throughout the valley. The mountains themselves answered. An avalanche thundered down the cliffs with unstoppable force. Victor's hidden army disappeared beneath an ocean of snow, shattered stone, and ancient ice. Soldiers abandoned their weapons as panic spread through their ranks. Horses bolted in every direction. The carefully planned ambush collapsed into complete chaos within moments. Mason barely escaped before the avalanche reached him, throwing himself towards safer ground as the entire valley trembled beneath nature's fury. When the roaring finally ceased, silence returned. Where Victor's army had once stood remained only broken armor scattered across the snow. Victor survived. Bruised, bleeding, and furious, he emerged from the wreckage with only a handful of guards remaining. Seeing everything he had built destroyed before his eyes, he abandoned every pretense of dignity. Drawing his sword, he charged directly toward Mason with the desperation of a man who understood he had already lost. Their blades collided with tremendous force. Victor fought with the skill of someone who had survived countless battles, but age had begun slowing him while Mason's determination only grew stronger with every strike. The duel carried them across the ruined battlefield until Victor finally managed to disarm Mason with a powerful swing. Charlotte cried out as Mason's sword slid across the frozen ground. Victor raised his weapon for the final blow. Before he could strike, Samuel stepped between them. The old warrior caught Victor's blade with his own. For several agonizing seconds, the two aging men stared into each other's eyes. "I protected him," Samuel said quietly. "You hunted him." Victor's expression hardened. "You doomed the kingdom." Samuel shook his head. "No, I saved it." With one final effort, Samuel forced Victor backward, creating enough space for Mason to recover his sword. Father had been denied. Childhood had been stolen. Years had been lost forever. Mason rose slowly, looking at the man responsible for all of it. Victor attacked again in blind rage, but this time Mason calmly stepped aside before delivering one clean strike that knocked the weapon from Victor's hands. The advisor collapsed onto the frozen ground, defeated at last. "I could end your life," Mason said. Victor laughed bitterly. "Then do it." Mason lowered his sword. "No. You've spent your entire life choosing hatred. I won't spend mine doing the same." Royal soldiers suddenly appeared from the southern road, surrounding the battlefield. At their center rode King Alexander. He had come himself. The aging ruler dismounted before anyone else moved. His eyes searched the battlefield until they found Mason standing only a few yards away. Neither spoke. 27 years of regret stood silently between father and son. Alexander slowly approached, removing the heavy fur cloak from his shoulders before kneeling in the snow. Every warrior watching fell completely silent. A king had knelt before the son he believed he had lost forever. "I don't ask you to forgive me," Alexander said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I only ask for the chance to tell you that there was never a day I stopped searching for a way to make things right. Every victory I celebrated reminded me of what I had sacrificed. Every winter I wondered whether you were alive. I failed you when you needed me most. That failure belongs to me alone." Mason looked at the man he had imagined countless times throughout his life. He saw neither the fearless ruler celebrated in songs nor the distant figure described by strangers. He saw an exhausted father carrying decades of unbearable regret. "You can't give me back the years," Mason answered. Alexander lowered his head. "I know, but—" Mason paused. "You came." The king slowly lifted his eyes. "And maybe that's where we begin." Alexander stood and embraced the son he had once believed was gone forever. Around them, even battle-hardened warriors struggled to hide their emotions. Samuel quietly smiled, knowing the promise he had made 27 years earlier had finally been fulfilled. Weeks later, the royal capital opened its gates to welcome Mason, not as a conqueror, but as the rightful heir the kingdom never knew it still had. The people expected a prince raised in luxury. Instead, they found a humble blacksmith who spent his first days helping rebuild villages damaged during Victor's campaign rather than celebrating inside the palace. That single decision earned the people's respect far more quickly than any royal ceremony ever could. Charlotte remained beside him through every challenge. Their love had survived secrets, betrayal, distance, and war because it had been built upon trust rather than power. One evening, standing together beneath shimmering northern lights overlooking the sea where Mason's story had begun, he reached into his pocket and removed a simple iron ring he had forged with his own hands years earlier. "It isn't made of gold," he said with a smile. "It doesn't have jewels. But I made it before I knew who I was." Charlotte laughed softly through tears. "That's exactly why it's perfect." She accepted the ring and kissed him as the northern lights danced across the sky, not as a princess claiming a prince, but as two ordinary souls who had chosen each other despite everything standing against them. King Alexander ruled only a few more peaceful years before willingly placing the crown into Mason's hands. The young ruler never allowed statues to be built in his honor or songs to exaggerate his victories. Instead, he ordered that the names of forgotten villages, loyal warriors, and ordinary families who had suffered because of political ambition be carved into stone for future generations to remember. Because kingdoms are not preserved by powerful rulers alone. They endure because ordinary people choose courage when fear seems easier. And perhaps the greatest legacy a parent can leave behind is not perfection, but the courage to admit when they were wrong before it's too late. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Do you think Mason made the right decision by sparing Victor, or would justice have meant something different? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this journey through forgotten legends, dark romance, and epic Viking adventure, don't forget to subscribe, because the next story may reveal another secret history that time almost erased.